Everybody, welcome to IPS. My name is Estelle Bunia-Fumaju. I'm an intern here for the Foreign Policy in Focus. We're very pleased today to host this event in collaboration with Compare Afrique. So this is the forum on the African diaspora and its responsibility toward Africa. So IPS is a community of public scholars linking peace and social justice in the U.S. and globally. And this year we're celebrating a 50th anniversary, so we really encourage you to sign in and stay in touch with us because we're going to have a lot of more interesting events. Please silence your phones, and thank you for your patience also. Silence your phones. We encourage you to tweet if you want to. And this event is going to be live streamed, so if anybody is opposed to this, well. So we're going to start now.
Hi, so just some background on Compare Afrique. Compare Afrique is a website dedicated to providing a forum for innovative writing and discussion about Africa's development challenges. We want to give a voice to those who are ready to look at the continent's problems in a fresh and inventive way. Also, we believe that now is the time for a rising generation of thinkers to develop and share new ideas and original ideas about Africa. So for this event, over 50 years ago, the architects of African independence met in Accra, Tunis, and Cairo to discuss the way forward for Africa. Then the discussion focused on post-colonial Africa and self-determination, economic and social development, and involved a burgeoning but small intellectual class who were mostly educated outside of the continent. Fast forward 50 years and approximately 30 million Africans now live outside of Africa. Considering that many of these Africans have greater access to capital, knowledge, and skills that could further fasten African development, are they the new architects of Africa's future? Do they have a further responsibility towards the social and economic development of their respective countries? So this discussion will be on how the diaspora, whether or not it is essential to Africa's development. Our panelists, we have Salome Lema, who is a philanthropist, activist, and organizer. She's the co-founder of Africans in the Diaspora, a new organization that aims to unleash the philanthropic and intellectual capital of the diaspora to advance sustainable development in Africa. We have Nia Kote, who is an Africa analyst based in Washington, D.C. To his right, we have Victoria Mwindi, who is a Kenyan citizen and founder and executive director of DevK, a public policy nonprofit organization currently in its launching stage, where she has been instrumental in the development of a strategic roadmap for this organization. And we have Thierry Uwamahoro, who is an Africa analyst at ABT Associates, where he currently coordinates projects implementation in Namibia and Cote d'Ivoire, and manages the Network for Africa Community for Practice.
I am going to moderate this event, and I think we can't really start a conversation about the diaspora without really defining what the diaspora is or what the African diaspora is. So the African Union defines the diaspora as people as consisting of peoples of African origin living outside the continent of Africa, irrespective of their citizenship and nationality, and who are willing to contribute to the development of the continent. So Salome, do you agree with this definition? It's very broad. And if not, what is your definition of what the African diaspora is?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having us. I do agree in that I understand it's broad for strategic reasons, that there is the broader diaspora. But we also have to recognize that the diaspora is complex, diverse, and a bit complicated. And when we talk about development and policy in Africa, then we would have to start segmenting and prioritizing and identifying who and what we're talking about specifically.
I think that the part that really stuck with me is the who are willing to contribute to the development of the continent. So if an African is living in this country and is not willing to contribute to the development of the continent, are they essentially, according to the AU, not part of the African diaspora? Lee, I see you thinking.
Putting on an act that I am thinking. I mean, I think the question is great, and let me apologize to everyone because I'll have to run into a meeting with some visiting delegation from Mali. It's already started, but I insisted I wanted to come. So if I leave, it's not because I'm the only gray-haired person here. I think it's a great question because I actually came wanting, I didn't know we were going to dive into the question like this because this is one of my points was going to be, what do you mean by the African diaspora? I went into a mayor's office looking for a book that I was saying, I used to teach at Georgetown and I insist people should read. So one book is by Professor Zeleza from Malawi, Africa's diasporas, that's plural. So the question is, who are the diaspora? And then the African Union's definition, which I have seen and which I sometimes take issue with. My question is, who is an African? Who is a person of African descent? I've been in this country, this is my like 37 years. I have family, relatives who've been here 3 years, okay? And I say that to say, if you dive into, if you read certain things, you will come up with a definition I used 2 years ago in a lecture. Every human being is an African. It's just a question of how long ago you left Africa, okay? So everybody is part of the diaspora is what I will say. Now I understand why the African Union will make the way they made it, but I think it's important to always interrogate their definitions and their questions and say, who is really an African?
Siri, are you agreeing with Professor Nee?
No, thank you for having us today for this event. I just want to add to what you're saying that it's this definition. I was also, when I was invited to come speak on this panel, I thought about the diaspora, what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And I saw this definition by the African Union, and there is a footnote by the definition. You should look in the report that was produced in 2005, and the footnote actually says that all delegations did not agree on that definition. There was one delegation that I wanted to mention before, those who reside outside of Africa, to say permanent. Those who permanently reside, that was a contentious point. But I find that definition interesting in the sense that it specifies some kind of, it kind of excludes certain people. So if you don't feel like
who?
If you feel you're African descent, you check that box. It's like a checklist.
Okay.
And then it comes, do you care about, do you want to contribute to the development of the African continent? That's not a checkbox. So somehow at that point, if you like, that really doesn't bother me, I don't think about it, I don't really care about that, it sounds like you're excluded at that point. And then they add the building of the African Union.
Yeah.
African Union as the institution, the African Union, the AU that we know. So there is, that definition excludes some people, but I'm starting to think that we each as individuals, toward the contribution to the development of the African continent, can include ourselves or exclude ourselves if you were to go by that definition.
Yeah.
I was joking with a friend saying that it's like how I'm from Burundi, how Burundi and Rwanda, Hutus and Tutsis, sometimes people go by their looks, others are like, those looks are misleading. You can never be 100% sure. But whatever the person says they are, whatever they choose to be, is really what they are. So I think, each one of us decide whether we fit in that African diaspora, if we took that definition.
Yeah. And so I think that goes into the next part of the question of responsibility. So if, according to Nee's definition, we're all African, is everyone on Earth individually responsible for development on the continent? Victoria?
I think it depends how you define contribution to development in Africa.
It's going to be a semantics.
Yeah, it kind of is. I think a lot of people think contributing means, sending money back home or like actively, advocating for something that's on the continent. But a lot of times contributing to the continent can be just, for example, sending remittances back home or just advocating for the fact that you're an African in the diaspora and then advocating that Africa is really a continent on the rise, or it's a continent where it's not just riddled with disease and civil wars. So I think when it comes to contribution to development, I think that's where a lot of Africans in the diaspora get caught, because that's where they don't know whether to define themselves as the African in the diaspora or just simply an African who's not living in the country they were born in.
And I think I find myself a lot being active when I'm countering someone and trying to change the definition of what they think Africa is. And so you're saying that that's a major part of being part of the diaspora is to be that person who's changing the single story.
Yeah. I mean, like, for example, it took me 6 years to understand that I was part of the diaspora community. Because I went home, like, every year, and I still thought I was a local, you know, like, still an African. And it took me such a long time to understand that, yes, I'm part of a diaspora community, and this is where I fit. So I think part of being African is part of understanding that you don't necessarily, part of being African in the diaspora is part of understanding that you don't necessarily have to actively, you know, work on development in the continent. But just by simply being an African who's not living in your country, you're doing something. You're telling a story to people that probably have never met another African, you know?
Yeah. You're nodding slowly.
I'm nodding because I do agree with a lot of what she's saying, but I think it resonates with me because I've been here 20 plus years and I still think I'm more African than I am American, even though I'm both. And I've finally gotten to the point where I understand being a member of the diaspora communities means accepting and embracing a very fluid identity that doesn't fit neatly into any particular box. And that's okay, and we have a value add that we need to grasp on and build and strengthen and amplify. But what I find really interesting when I engage in conversations about the role of the diaspora or who the diaspora is, it's very global north driven. So when we talk about the diaspora's contribution to Africa's development, we're often thinking of the Africans in the diaspora in Europe or in North America. But the global African diaspora is also Africans in Africa. Anyone that's outside of its own country, I consider part of the diaspora. And they have an important role in their country's development as well. And in fact, a lot of people within Africa travel for economic reasons. And we need to start thinking about how do we really, when we have these conversations and think about developing again the role of the diaspora, how do we engage Africans in the diaspora that are in Africa?
That brings me to a question that I had. A reader wrote on our website that an important responsibility is to not assume that the diaspora are the sole agents of change. She writes that if we ignore the agency of Africans back home, we start to feed into this single story where Africans have no agency and are not able to understand their agency without the help of others. So when I find myself as the only African in the room, I always feel like I have to say I am speaking as me, as Jumoke, and not as an African, because people see an African and what comes out of your mouth is you're speaking for a billion people. How do you try to not usurp agency, I guess?
Well, I think, there are many different approaches, and sometimes they can even seem contradictory, because, in fact, sometimes I take the approach opposite to what you take. I want to remind people I am African, in case you haven't noticed. So, and I say, look, I believe in what I'm saying. I will match my views with anybody's, because if there is an issue I feel like I don't know anything about, I keep quiet. But if I speak, I think I'm as good as anybody. So I say, well, I'm not speaking for a billion Africans, but I'm speaking as an African, because I don't think you can find an American who can speak for all 300 million Americans, or a Chinese person who can speak for 1.3 billion people. So there's diversity in every group, but I'm very proud of my group. Now, what Victoria said that and your first question, it also goes to the agency. The willingness to be part of Africa's development. It seems to me, it brought to my mind an African proverb from Ghana, which says, if you have a relative in the other village, you never buy a blind cow, because your relative will go and check out the cows, and therefore you get a good cow, you don't pay bad money. And for me, what that says is the only way you can say you really belong to your native village is if you do the things that help your village. If you are in another village and your relatives buy a cow that is blind, you have by definition excluded yourself. So I think, to me also, if you're an African, and I agree, this is what I think Professor Zeleze's book is wonderful because he does talk about what do we mean by the African diaspora. It's not just those in America. It's not just those in, the U.S. Census also has a great definition. It calls it the African born. Because let's not forget African Americans here. So for all of those reasons, there are many different diasporas. It is what we do. And then just one quick thing on the agency question. I made a note to myself that I'll just make 2 points. What do we mean by the diaspora? And then, and I wanted to announce, look, I am naturally contrarian. That's my small contrarianness. The big one is this. Why are we saying, what can the diaspora do for Africa? How about what can Africa do for the diaspora? And the OAU is doing this. Several years ago, they held a series of meetings in Manhattan. I was part of it, and that's what I told them. They were thinking more conventionally of the diaspora as African-borns and African-Americans here. And I'm saying you see it as a one-way street. What can they do for the continent? How about asking, this is a relationship. It can't be just go and help Africa. Okay? We need to look out for each other and see how we can help each other.
And I think, Salome, what you're working on with AID really is that relationship, that two-way relationship. Can you go further into that? And then I want to get to Victoria and the work she's doing with DevK.
Sure. So at AID, Africans in the Diaspora, what we're attempting to do is to create a platform for the diaspora, global African diaspora to contribute to Africa's development. But the way we approach it is through a relationship process. And how we do that, we have a funds platform whereby we mobilize the diaspora to invest in African organizations, and it's an equal exchange. It's not to say that the diaspora knows more or matters more, but it's to say there are skills and knowledge and ideas in Africa and resources and passion in the diaspora, and how can we marry those two together. So for us, on the question of agency, I wouldn't say the most important part, but a critical part of it is, do we own our own institutions, and are we driving, designing, funding, and implementing our own initiatives? Until we do that, then our agency will often be compromised, and AID is attempting to challenge that.
And with DevK, you are doing pretty much the opposite of what a lot of African youths are doing. They're trying to get to this country or to the West, and there's not that many diversity visas but you are going back to Kenya to start a public policy initiative. Why did you make that decision?
Actually, I've been thinking about it for a year. And I just finished my master's a few weeks ago. I just graduated, and I had the opportunity to basically stay for OPT or, take the green card. I had the applications all set. And I just remember thinking, if I stay here, I'll feel like I'm dead, because I have this, I don't want to just help, or I don't want to do something that's connected to Africa from this side. I actually want to be on the ground, because a lot of times, I think, going back to what you're talking about, agency, a lot of times we Africans are in the dangerous spot of falling into that, into thinking that we're better than the Africans on the ground, into thinking that we know better the challenges on the ground. And really, what I've noticed, I've gone back to Kenya now almost 3 times a year for the past 3 to 4 years. And what I've noticed is every single time I discover something new that I didn't know. You talk to people on the ground, you discover something you didn't know. So what DevK is trying to do is we're trying to kind of encourage that conversation amongst the diaspora community and those locally, so that it's one conversation, so that we can actually, like what Salome was saying, we can actually come up with African solutions to African problems, that all Africans are actually participating in that conversation, not just Africans in the diaspora.
Yeah. So what challenges and obstacles? Because when you told me this, I was just like, oh, okay. And I was thinking about just the challenges and the things that are going to come up to set up shop. And you want employees, you want researchers. I mean, what have you faced, building this from the ground up?
God. Well, one, I've heard so many people say I'm too young. First get a job, get to know the industry back home. And in some, in the master's, you kind of work while you're still doing school. And for about 2 years, I did work with the Sub-Saharan Africa Chamber of Commerce. And so you kind of get to network with people like that. But, I've heard also people saying, this is too big. What are you talking about? This can't happen. How do you intend to engage the diaspora from, going back to Kenya. But I think the one thing we need to realize is we can't necessarily think we're going to change something if we think it's impossible. Even if the rest of the world thinks it's impossible, we have to take that step and try it. And I think that's, to me, that's the biggest thing that I've encountered since starting DevK.
So, Thierry, oh, sorry.
No, I just want to quickly make a comment of the question of the agency and the contribution. And I'm very much in favor of what they're saying about the diaspora and how sometimes this narrative of this magic bullet that's going to come and save Africa, I think it's missing a lot. You know, I'm reading about Ugandan students in Makerere University developing these apps that midwives can use for prenatal care for mothers. I'm reading about, there's a Burundian student and a friend of his who are in Burkina Faso who developed an anti-malaria soap. Those are usually, there is a lot of talent on the continent that I think the diaspora can probably support. Otherwise we become almost like, those people who criticize international NGOs that think they know it all and they can come and, implement. So I think that's an important point. On the point of the contribution to the diaspora, I think the book you mentioned about the definitions of there being more than one, diasporas, and I think whatever category one would fall under will probably dictate the level of contribution one is.
Yes.
That's appropriate.
Yes.
But the definition of the AU of other definitions, or if you think of the Bob Marley song in Africa Unite, he talks about unite for the Africans abroad. I think his definition was much broader, Africans abroad.
Yes.
I think the contribution of some, like a Burundian or a Ugandan born who's in the U.S. might be different from what's relevant for somebody who left, 400 years ago. So I think that different diasporas can dictate the level of contributions that take place.
You're nodding.
Yeah, and I wanted to say to Victoria that your idea is great. I mean, I think that when you want to do something important, you will face difficulties. One good way is that it tests your own commitment and it makes you strong. So that's par for the course. But you also ought to know that good ideas last a long time. The reason I'm saying that is that, one of the jobs I've done in Washington that I'm very proud of is 12 years I work at Trans-Africa. And we pushed the Reagan administration to drop its support of the apartheid government. Now, we are very careful to say we did not end apartheid. South Africans ended apartheid. But until 1986, the U.S. was actually supporting the white government. And under Reagan, we pushed and Congress changed that policy. And so I'm very proud of that. And the reason I'm linking it is one of the lessons I learned from Trans-Africa, I said, if you have a good advocacy organization, it makes the government better. And I know that we all here, we see too many negative stories about Africa. So we don't like it. But the fact of the matter is that we have a lot of negatives. One of them is our government. And so the idea I got at Trans-Africa is, every African country really needs a strong public policy institution where the people are fearless. Yeah. Now, it's more dangerous. I mean, a quick anecdote. In the 80s when we were doing this, I was standing in front of the White House and criticized Reagan. I'm from Ghana. My age is not that much different from Jerry Rawlings, and he was the president. And I always thought if I stood in Ghana at that time and criticized him, I wouldn't go home to sleep. But I was able. So I'm saying it's easier in the U.S. Some African countries, you speak out and you are in trouble. In fact, I have a list of African capitals I'm not going to because I criticize their presidents. Oh, Rwanda is one of them. Uganda is one of them. Ethiopia is one of them. Because I think these are dictatorships, and I have a big problem with African dictatorships. Yeah. But my point is, this is a very good idea. I always thought that a good thing to do for African countries would be to help people there set up institutions and do things similar to what Trans-Africa did here. It opposed the government, it forced the government to change a bad policy. I think every African country needs a lot of that. So I'm glad that you are doing that. And we need more than one. Every country needs many of them. So don't let people tell you that it's too difficult, it can't be done, you are too... Just smile at them and say, okay, thank you, and then go on and do it anyway.
So this oh, sorry, that's all.
Just wanted to add, I do think it's a great idea, and I'm always, what I find often striking is a lot of the conversations that take place about the diaspora's role in Africa take place within the diaspora, or they're being convened and driven by large international development institutions or government agencies like the USAID and the World Bank. But how much of this conversation is taking place within Africa? Are we listening to what Africans in Africa, African civil society organizations, African leaders are saying in terms of what they need from the diaspora? Because ultimately, that's what needs to drive our action, not what we think here.
I want to just nuance a little bit a point that you just raised about, as it relates to the diaspora, when it comes to public policy and maybe more like on the political front as you oppose dictatorships. On that front, I think the diaspora is going to be almost as divided as the Africans themselves, because as much as there is part of the diaspora that's saying, you know, this is a dictatorship, this needs to change, there is another, sometimes equally powerful segment of African diaspora that's saying the opposite. So that can be an interesting...
And forgive me, I'll just say I agree with you, but I would say that in fact, you know, I could go on for days, and I'll keep it short. But for me, part of democracy is disagreement. Okay,
Yeah.
I have friends who tell me, "Nee, you even disagree with yourself." Okay, so for me, the fact that some people in Africa will say, "No, this is not a dictatorship. This is what we need." Let's have that disagreement. Let's have that debate, and which is why. One of the things about I like everything about democracy, but the important thing is when you have to take an action, you debate, but at the end of the day, you make a decision. Sometimes the decision making is voting. So what I want is let's have a discussion. If you think this is a good government, yes, disagree with me. The only thing is nobody should be jailed or killed for disagreeing with anybody else.
I think this conversation has me thinking about two questions. One is, how do we influence policy here? Because we understand that a lot of the policy made in this country affect Africa. And two, how should we be involved in policy making within the continent from here? As an American citizen and a Nigerian citizen, how much vocal should I be in how the Nigerian government does, you know, whatever it is that you do?
I mean, okay, so part of the, for example, the White House right now has this initiative. It has an African initiative. I think for the past 3 to 4 years it's had this special, you know, African initiative. And the conversations, at least, that I have witnessed and been a part of, like at the Department of Labor, you go there and you look at the discussions and the people around the table, you can probably count 2 to 3 Africans. And you're wondering, they're talking about policy. They're talking about, you know, initiatives that affect our continent, and yet we don't have representatives at that table, you know, where they're talking, and it's...
But is it that we don't have them, or is it that we are not,
Exactly.
as a whole, not really interested in doing that? Because I find I get really, really emotional about certain things, and right now my thing is the immigration bill, and how the diversity visa literally just cut 50,000, like, you know, Africans come to this country. But yet, I have not heard one person, you know, rally for this or say, hey, what can we do? So, like, is it that we're being excluded, or is that we're just not interested and we're just interested in other things and not policy?
I think it's kind of both. I think there's that fear that when you intervene in policy, American policy, even if it's foreign policy, you have those people that say, well, wait a minute, you're not American. Why are you talking about, you know, our policies? I think there's that fear to do with you don't want to be seen as someone who is, I guess, anti-American or advocating for your own continent. But it's something I think we have to break through. You're very right. A lot of us are not willing to step into that space and actually, you know, engage in that conversation, which we should. We should actually look to do that.
Maybe sometimes you're overwhelmed by that question of what to do for Africa. You know, I mean, just like there's so many different issues, and people pick and choose what they care about. There is a friend of mine. Many of you might know him, like Bemba Dizolele. I don't know if you know him. He quite a few times he testified at Congress about Congo. He's like he's Congolese and American at the same time.
Yeah.
I think to a certain extent it might depend on the level of access that we have to influencing that. You know, whether you write a blog, whether you put it on your Facebook or whether you go to testify in Congress might depend on the level of access you have. But then again, it doesn't exclude, somebody protesting at the fence of the White House about, I don't know if you protest about the visa at the White House, like
Just call my congressman.
you call your congressman, so the usual pressure to your government. And sometimes I guess there is a distinction between, policy and just politics. And I think...
What is the distinction?
The distinction is, actually, I like those two words because in French, they're the same thing. They're all politique. But policy is usually more like you argue your case on why a certain thing would be better versus like another thing. This is the policy that we should have about something. But usually politics, there's some jokering, different interests, and somebody wants to get ahead, and that's a bit complicated. And that's when even the diaspora can be divided on who is a dictator and who's not a dictator. I think that's more politics than policy at sometimes.
Yeah, the way I will define answer your question about the differences, I've noticed people use politics negatively. So I like to think people say, if they are positive about the process, they call it democracy. If they don't like it, they call it politics. What's the difference between politics and policy? I think politics is getting rid of your rival because it's all about power, okay? Shoving others aside. Policy is describing things that you want done and making arguments for them, and it can be mixed. Now, influencing policy here, I think it is so important. For me, I think I'm a walking epitome of that. That's what I do. Yesterday, I testified in Congress on Mali. And I went with several copies of previous testimonies I have made. And frankly, I am so glad this event is happening, and I'm glad for the audience, because I've been doing this for decades, and I feel lonely about it. Yeah. And I joke that, look, okay, maybe back home in Africa, like I hinted about Ghana, many countries, if you go on TV and criticize the government, you are in trouble. Maybe the TV won't even put you on. But whether it's radio or TV or Congress or writing, I do it all the time, and I'm living for the day when more and more of the Africans here.
So is it lonely at the policy world being an African? Do you see other African faces?
Oh, I see, but not enough. Because, Salome and I were just chatting that when President Obama won in 2008, a lot of us thought, wow, now we'll get a different kind of Africa policy. But I actually still defend him by saying, whoever the president is, regardless of his color, he needs pressure to do something. I was on the radio and somebody told me, politicians are weather vanes. So they will just point and move wherever there is a strong push. If there is no strong push, if President Obama doesn't feel pressure from voters, then the fact that his father is Kenyan, and I happen to think he's proud of it, he's not ashamed of it, but he won't do much unless he's pressured. So we have to find a way of pressuring him. I even think that he would like it, because look at the opposition he gets from various quarters. If he did something on his own initiative, it will be played out like, hey, he's giving our treasure to his father's country. So he needs the pressure to say, I'm doing it because Africans want me to do it. So I'm disappointed actually that in the 5 years he's been in power, we haven't pushed him.
Can I just
He's part of the African diaspora, is he?
Oh, yes.
Does he identify as such?
Yes.
Just to add to that, I think I would agree that for many it's lonely in the policy world, but we should also ask why. Is it that we don't have Africans engaged in policy and wanting to do policy, or is it that we don't have access and opportunities to build our advocacy or policy institutions and voice? And I think we really need to have a conversation about resources. There have been many efforts by Africans to engage in policy, but they don't have access to the money to be able to organize, to be able to convene, and to be able to exist in a sustainable way. So we come and go in waves.
Yeah, what I was thinking? On the way here, I was thinking we need a lobbying group. We need several African lobbyists, and within those, like several countries with lobbyists, because that's how you get access in Washington is to have lobbyists. And so, not one person standing out in front of the White House is awesome and great, but we need the power that comes with that.
I think also when we talk about engaging in policy, I think it's important to realize that it's not all about advocacy.
Yeah.
I think sometimes engaging in policy can, for example, just putting yourself in a conversation that you haven't been, or that, the Africans have not been invited to before. Just, I think when it comes to, like standing outside the White House, that is great, but I think we have to realize that wherever you are, you have that responsibility to speak out, and that in itself is changing policy if you're believing in something and speaking out against something. But like, for example, the scientists of the NIH who's working, for example, on cancer cells, something like that, they're doing something that can have a lasting, effect on Africa, but they're not necessarily lobbying for something. So, yeah.
I was going to say, unlike politics where anybody can probably engage in and try to shove everybody else and then get ahead, policy to a certain extent might require a certain technical knowledge of the subject matter you're discussing.
Yeah.
And, that might be one of the limiting, factors. I mean, we have African diaspora, I think, is in the U.S. like the most educated, I think.
Supposedly.
Supposedly, okay. I haven't seen it there, right? But I think that can help in making sure he doesn't feel lonely if more people are engaged. Yeah.
So we talked about policy in America. What about policy back home? Like voting rights for people who are dual citizenship. I mean, how involved should Africans in this country who are dual citizens or who are pretty much, yeah. So how much say should we have with policy in different countries, or even at the AU? Like,
I think we do, and forgive me. I think we have to do two balanced things. The issue about not forgetting the agency of people back home and not giving them the impression that we think we are superior just because we've come here.
Yeah.
And we do that a lot, and it blows up in our face. It has blown up in my face, and we need to be careful about that. So there I'll say, yes, we need to go, and I'm saying do what you are doing. But two things, we need to be humble and listen. Listen to people because they know it better. Now, but the link with policy here, at least this is my take. This is just one person's take, especially because of my focus on, there is a universal debate, but it's heated in Africa, which is, should you put democracy first or should you put development first? Okay? I happen to believe that you should put democracy first. Okay? So I'm against dictatorships. Now, here is the dirty secret of U.S. foreign policy in Africa. The U.S. loves to support dictators. Okay? So for me, yes.
They call it stability.
yes. But you see, it comes back to blow up in their face every time. Now, Africa is big and complex, and so I even feel a little nervous saying I'm speaking on Africa. And I certainly don't want to say I'm an expert on the world. But even outside Africa, the U.S. support of dictators actually hurts the U.S. So the way I link domestic policy in Africa with policy here is to say to the U.S., and I say it all the time, you support dictators and you are hurting your own interests. Okay, so you ought to stop supporting dictators. And for me, it's a respect for Africa, okay, because democracy is respectful. Whether it's Nigeria or Uganda or Kenya or Ghana or Ethiopia or anywhere else, the point is let them decide what the policies would be. What system allows them to decide is democracy. Okay, let everybody there organize, argue, elect whomever they want. They don't like it, they will throw him out. Okay, and they will do that. So for me, I think what I say here to the U.S. is do no harm. And when you support dictators, you are hurting the African country and you are hurting even your own interests.
I think in terms of can we have a voice in domestic policy issues, we can play a role, but I would encourage us to do it in partnership with national, local policy organizations in the specific countries that we're pursuing policy change in. There, I have met tremendous civil society organizations across Africa that are engaged in really interesting policy work. They need resources, and some need capacity strengthening. And that's where we can add value. So we can play a role, but again, be humble, listen, and do it in partnership with what's already being done on the ground.
I think to what Rosh just said, I'm from Burundi, and in the last, maybe 5-10 years, Burundi has been known for having a very vibrant civil society. And there is the policy talk when we pressure Washington, but then I think there's another much more important policy talk when it comes to pressuring our own governments. Because I think change is going to have to come from our own countries and our own governments. Yes. And then they can be empowered to even face the world. We might talk about Pan-Africanism later, but that might be another topic. So I have, I've been lucky to be in touch with a lot of Burundian civil society activists and journalists, and some things that have happened through just casual conversations. There's this issue they're facing. How about try this strategy? I've heard in this other country they tried it and it worked. And supporting them. The bigger challenge though is most of these civil society organizations in Africa are funded by Western NGOs.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's a role that diaspora can play in strengthening civil societies in our own countries. One of the attacks they get from the government, because they're treated as the opposition.
Yes.
Something happened after the elections in Burundi, if you followed it, and most of the opposition leaders fled the country. So the civil society stayed on the ground, and the ones who are speaking up on every policy issue, every human rights violation, now they're seen as the opposition. So they're attacked as working for the enemy of Burundi,
Yes.
who is the international community.
Yes.
So their legitimacy is somewhat undermined by those attacks. Even though in the response they say, our government is financed by almost 60-70% by donors. So are you also anti this country? But I think having some sort of support to the civil society, and so they have this legitimacy and they're working with the diaspora, and the diaspora is supporting those efforts, will go a long way towards influencing policy and democratic change in our countries.
No, absolutely. And I think that's precisely the reason why we built Africans in the Diaspora, to have a direct platform through which we can support African civil society organizations through money and capacity strengthening. But I think what's also interesting about organizations getting foreign funding, it's not only how the government views them, it's how it shifts their own visions and agendas. The more funders you have, the more you're accommodating each funder's ideas and each funder's priorities. And, in short time, you've lost sight of what you set out to do in the first place. And I think the role we can play as diasporans is really support the visions, ideas, and priorities of our civil society organizations on the ground, and trust them to be able to undertake the work without attempting to drive it through our own ideas and our own lens.
If I might, I'm nervous because Amira is here. I'm talking too much, but in my defense, I'll say I have a lot of stories to tell. Let me tell you about the funding thing in Africa. I was telling Jumoke that I'm from Ghana, but I lived in Nigeria. I lived in Nigeria because I started George Soros's Foundation for West Africa. And I had persuaded him to do it, and then he said, you go do it. So I was in Nigeria giving out money to support democratic institutions, and I enjoyed the 3 years there very much. Here's what happened. I will meet, the donors will have weekly meetings, DFID, USAID, the other foundations, Rockefeller, and we will sit together. And later on, I'll be talking to the Nigerian friends, and I'll say to them, why do you ask me what we want to fund? Okay, I said, civil society, your job is to say, okay, government is unable or unwilling to do this or should not be doing this. We are in Nigeria, we know what problems are there that the government is not addressing, so you should be telling us, here is a problem we are focused on, here is what we are working on, here is why it is important, now fund us. And they said to me, you've lived in Washington too long. Because if we tell you that you are Ghanaian, you are African, you will understand. These others, if we tell them, they won't fund us because they come with things they know they want to fund. So we have learned by bitter experience that you need to find out if they want to work on children's issues, then you give them a children's proposal. If they want to work on women's issues, you give them a women's proposal. Because if you told them, no, that's the second issue for us, here is the number one issue, They won't give you any money. Now, I mean, I was glad that I got Soros to go into West Africa because I think they are doing a lot of good work to support democracy. At the same time, I do worry. I mean, you have to take my word about it, but I do worry that civil society is critical for democracy. But if your funding is coming from outside, okay, it is a problem. The civil society in the United States, the funding doesn't come from outside the United States. So it's a difficult problem to the extent that the diaspora here, who are closely linked with Africa, can create funds where the strings are not too strong, so that the people on the ground who are doing good work will get money to do what they have found out is good, rather than saying, we have the money, you do what we tell you. So hopefully the diaspora can help find those funding.
I think we have, do you guys have any questions? I think we have, yeah, it's about time. So anyone have any questions for Nee before he jets out?
Hi. I just want to compliment the panel. I think this has been an absolutely wonderful discussion. I've learned so much. I'm sort of interested in policy issues. I'm not really into it, but this has just opened my eyes, and I just love the comments that were made, and this has really been a mini education for me. My name is Veda. I'm originally from Liberia, and so that's my comment, sort of, but what I'd like need to comment on is the perception from Africa, domestically. Because right now there's a big debate in Liberia on dual citizenship. And the irony, of course, is just incredible in terms of, you know, Liberians not wanting Liberians to have dual citizenship with America. So the question here is, what happens when Africans in the diaspora go back and they compromise that trust? Because I believe 20, 30 years ago, we were welcomed back with open arms, but now there is a cynicism that has set in because of what has happened in the past 20, 30 years. Each returning wave comes back, and there's political instability, there's upheaval, there's civil war. And so now, I think on the ground, Africans in the diaspora, at least from the Liberia point of view, they're looking at Africans as troubles, you know, they're not welcoming. In fact, they want them to stay where they are. So I'd like you to comment on that and give some insight. Thank you.
So the question is, what happens when the diaspora goes back home and faces cynicism and is not welcome?
Yes. Again, I mean, I think it's a great question. It is a real challenge and a problem that we have to deal with. And again, you know, I came here to grad school. I stayed a long time, but I go back and forth. I mean, I've gone to live in Ghana and work. Sometimes I've gone with congressional delegations. And one time I went and got into a fierce argument with an AID director because I thought they were dictating too much to Ghana, and I was furious because they had thick books. You should do this, 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 this. And we were on a trip, so I debated with him. We argued. And then when we were coming back, of course, the driver of the bus was a Ghanaian, and so I said to him, I assumed that he was agreeing with me because I'm Ghanaian, and he said later when we drop everybody off, I switched to a Ghana language and I was talking to him, and I was shocked at the hostility and cynicism also directed at me. He said, of course I don't agree with the American, but they are paying my salary, so I can't tell him. And you, I don't agree with you because when things got hard in Ghana, you ran away, you lived a good life, you come back and you have all these airs on. This happened in, I think, that might be 1994. So what I'm saying, this was 19 years ago. Well, it's gotten worse, which is why the answer to your question is what I had said before. I don't think we can have, you know, a strategy that will fit everybody. It is for individuals. And my advice then is when you go back, This is where I agree with the Africa Union definition. You must be willing to help. It comes from your heart. If you are willing to help, then you should also go with humility, okay? And listen. I mean, I was just lucky to come here. I grew up with people in Ghana who were far smarter than me, so it was just by accident that I came here. So I think once you've come here, if you go back thinking just because, it's a way of actually disrespecting Africa to say, if I spend 5 days abroad, then all of a sudden I'm better than other Africans, okay? That is a bad message. So I think it's difficult, it's there, you should know that cynicism is there, but individually it has to be what you think you can contribute, and please be humble and listen. So then you can know where you can make a difference.
Terry?
I'd like to comment. I think this is where the policy and politics discussion we're having might come, to play. You have to wonder why. The fact that you're not welcome, is it the authority, the government, those in power, or is it the general population?
No, this is the general. No, the government is in favor of dual citizenship. Yes. It is the people who don't want it.
Because on the politics side, sometimes there might be restrictions because they don't want somebody to come back, they don't want certain people to come back. But what I think your answer is perfect in terms of if it's the general population, it's like, what are you contributing? So how are you going to be better off?
What are you doing? Yeah.
By you coming back, how are you going to be better off? Yeah.
And what are you doing back home? Because I feel like a lot of my friends who went back home the last few years were like, well, America's too cold, or I can't find a job here, I'm going to go back home. It was a very self-interested thing to go back. And so I think that would be met with cynicism.
But it's also important, sorry, I'll just keep it short. It's important to put it in historical context. So you talked about Liberia. So given the history of Liberia, we need to put it within that context and understand what do we need to do to bridge and shift public perceptions of diasporans going back into Liberia. It's probably different in Ethiopia, so we would have to adopt a different strategy for Ethiopia.
Yeah, exactly. You said it perfectly. I was going to say, I think we need to be careful to stop transporting problems in, one African country to another African country. I think that is very specific to Liberia's history. I think it's one of the only countries in Africa that saw such a huge, influx of the diaspora coming back into their country, and just, the civil war that happened there. I think I definitely understand how that can be, an issue for the Africans that were there and never came to America and then went back. So I think that's definitely a conversation to be had, but also I think that's very specific to Liberia.
And I think one of the good things, I was implying that politics is a dirty thing, but the good political skills are important. And I'll tell you, even in families, I come from a big family. I have family members who are older than me, and in our tradition, I don't speak until they speak. Okay, so when I go home, I find out that it works. If I say, look, I've been gone a long time. I'm like a little child, so please educate me, okay? Whatever is happening, I'm listening. Please tell me what has gone on. What do you think? Sometimes I'll just keep quiet and they say, oh, everybody has spoken except you. I know that shows a mirror, but I can keep my mouth shut. So I'm saying it works. I have known other Ghanaians who have been here and they go back. My brother got into a big shouting match with a cousin. He said, well, you've been there 5 years, your father died, you come back and you are dictating to everybody. Nee has been there 30 years and every time he comes back he says, you tell me what to do. So I think a little political skill will ease the way for you. You have to make people realize that you want to help and you are humble. If you come on with airs, they will cut you down to size.
To broaden the discussion a little bit, I'll add that sometimes that sentiment might be the same as when people refuse immigrants to come in the country. Sometimes because of either economic slowdown of a country, you might be seen as coming either to take jobs or to take something away from those who were there and they didn't even have enough to begin with. So that might be, something that applies to that case for Liberia.
There was a question over. Yeah, the question. Yeah.
So my question is that there's been a lot of talk about political aspects, but also I have a mixed background. My father's from Haiti and I'm from Rwanda. And growing up and coming from these two very interesting places, I was not socialized to, when you are growing up, you're going through school, you're encouraged to become a lawyer, become a doctor, become an engineer, these things. And a lot of times families don't, in the U.S., for those who are born here, they don't place or don't know how to encourage their kids to participate in politics back at home. So do you want to share some of your experiences, some of those who grew up here, about how you were able to come into your position? I mean, now I work on policy, but how you were able to come into your position and move past those, against those limitations.
So the question is, a lot of African or immigrant parents want their kids to have very traditionally successful endeavors. So engineering, lawyer, doctor, and for the kids who want to be in policy, how do you go against that? I just did it, and I just apologized later. I was just like, I literally changed my major and didn't tell them until it was too late.
But sometimes it's coming from, depending on the country, the region, they have fear because they've seen from their own experience what happens when you engage in politics. So how do we push that upon the next generation?
I mean, okay, so I'm careful about saying that I was brought up here because I was technically brought up in Kenya, even though I kept traveling here every year. But the one thing my father always said is, you're going to law school. It doesn't matter what you want to do, you're going to law school. After law school, you can decide what you want to do. So I did it. I went to law school. And during the first year, I was like, no, I want to do what I want to do. So I ended up doing both a master's and a law school at the same time. And I think I needed that. I think sometimes as kids, we tend to think that, we know better than our parents. But a lot of times we need to realize that our parents have lived, in Africa. They know what it means to really be destitute. These are this is the generation that, came from really, when they talk about the children that walk barefoot to school, that's the generation. I mean, the stories my father tells me. And I think for me, the fact that I went to law school, I'm very grateful for that. I think it put in me this it put me this analytic attitude to where now I analyze everything, and I think that's what's made me who I am today. So I think, yes, we should definitely, like Jamoke, definitely, just do what you want to do, but a lot of times, seriously, just listen to your parents, because they really do understand what it takes to make it in this world and what it takes to actually, do what you want to do.
I know why I was feeling so warmly towards Victoria. Because I'm an immigrant parent. I have two adult children. I have two, and I'm one of the people who walk barefoot to school. I can tell you stories. When I say it, my friends say, oh no, you want to run for president and you are just making up good stories about yourself. Okay? I walk barefoot I did everything. I'm a pretty good cook because I had to cook. I learned to cook. I learned to do everything. But what I will say, we are talking about development in Africa, which is important.
Yeah.
And let's not forget, I'm also saying we should also ask for what can Africa do for the diaspora. It's mixed. But another part of, the challenge for Africa is to change its image. So in fact, what I will say to you, going into policy is great. I mean, it's in my blood. But not everyone has to do it. I mean, it may sound like a cliche, but if you are of African background, whatever it is you are good at, you are giving Africa a positive image. Okay, whatever it is, I mean, anything I do, I say, look, I want to be the best at this. When I was teaching at Georgetown, I wanted to be the best professor there. When I worked for Soros, I wanted to be the best executive director he had. And then say, by the way, I'm African. So I'm saying, pick something that you feel comfortable with, shine at it, and don't be too guilty that you are not into policy.
The question I mean is diaspora engagement. I work in policy now, and I went to grad school and all that stuff, and I'm a little bit older than I may appear, but I'm talking in terms of getting the diaspora engaged. Do you think that that's one obstacle that is in the way?
I think for me, when I was growing up,
Her question was, is it an obstacle for the diaspora to engage?
what our parents'
now, yeah.
expectations. Right. I think when I was growing up, it was a challenge to convince them, by the way, I'm going to study international relations and go back and work. It was hard. And what I had, fortunately, my parents were somewhat open and were willing to entertain the idea, but what I also did was look to Africans who are doing the type of work I was doing. At that time, there weren't that many that were publicly visible. But thank God Kofi Annan was the Secretary General. So for my family at that time, it was, oh, well, you go work for the UN and World Bank. because that's what their notion of giving back meant then. And over time, I've been able to kind of even then, I would share with them stories of Africans who are doing really interesting work, like the Green Belt movement. I remember finding out about it my sophomore year of college, Wangari Maathai's organization, and I went home and told everybody I knew about it. So that was my way of exposing them to the range of possibilities and opportunities that we could explore. Then I had to find what was my niche, what was I good at. And for now, what I realized, there are more of us here, and I think it's important for us to go back and translate what we've learned and what we know to our own diaspora communities here so that younger generations understand and feel like there are people they can look to if this was an option they wanted to explore.
I think the question of visibility is a good one because my sister wants to be a writer now. And then my parents are like, Tejuko!
Yeah.
Like, there's that one person they can
Exactly.
point to. And so in policy, it was like Kofi Annan.
Exactly.
And so if we shine in anything and there's one of us who is visible and out there, it's so much easier to, like, convince your parents to let you study IR or painting or art or...
I think being a normal, one of the African diaspora role players here in the NGO community is Muiza Muntali at Trans-Africa. And he and I are very close friends, and we joke all the time. We are activists. We learn from Randall Robinson that activists are not normal people, okay? They are political junkies. Not everybody can be an activist, okay? It's like salt. Nobody eats only salt. You need a little bit of it in food to make it taste good. The point I'm making, therefore, is it seems to me our diaspora community, again, this is something I've thought a lot about how to engage the diaspora community, and I have changed. I don't want every person of African descent to be like me. The people have normal lives and family to take care of. They can contribute, and for me as an activist, my thinking is, okay, I'll go into a diaspora community, maybe have a meeting and say, okay, this time, since I work on U.S. foreign policy, I'd like you to call your congressman or to write a letter. Maybe once in 6 months I'll ask them to do that. But for me, I do it 24/7. So what we ask of the diaspora community depends. Sometimes you can say, okay, contribute $5 to this, or call your congressman, or even, part of what Africa fights is bad press image. So sometimes you can even say, write a letter to the newspaper, or to the website, or to the TV station. So the normal people in the diaspora community, we ask them for small contributions every now and then. Being an activist is something inside you. And if you have it, you won't be able to sleep or do anything else. So for that one, you just have to explain to your parents, this is me. I didn't decide it, but I have to do this.
Estelle, you had a question?
Yes, I have a question. When I got to U.S., which was August 2012, I was really surprised to see the amount of organization that were focusing on Africa, because I don't know, I was really shocked, to be honest. I was like, wow, I didn't know it mattered so much here. But the thing is, but I also realized that there is no communication between these organizations. You have 20 organizations that were called Freedom for Africa, Freedom of Africa, Freedom for Africans. And they don't know they exist, or maybe they do, but they don't work together. So my question is like, why is that? And maybe if there was just one single united voice of all of you, then maybe it could be more effective. So why is that, and how can you change it?
Let's take that question, and then the gentleman in the back has had a question.
Thank you all for from Nigeria and also America. My point is not really it's kind of like a comment on what Neil says about the fear of dying. If you speak up against the government, you will die. And over time, most people that bring about changes don't live to see those changes.
Yeah.
So if we're afraid of dying, I don't think Africa will be able to change. And the second thing is about, we're talking about how to raise funds to, do things back home. And I'm wondering, how many of these organizations have been pushing around colleges in the U.S. to send most African descent back to Africa, like every semester people get to like study abroad program. But it's very few Africans that actually go to Africa to do all those. So if I can get a 3 credit or 6 credit summertime, why can't I pay my ticket and go do that in Africa? That way, like, your organizations would even spend as much money. And it will also be like another avenue for Africans in diaspora to know what is actually going on the ground.
So Estelle's question was about the plethora of organizations who are not really working together and are very disorganized. And then the gentleman's question was about Africans studying abroad, or at least young Africans in universities being more connected to the continent.
I promise I'll do 2 short answers, then I have to run.
Okay.
I think I would say especially I think it should be generational, and I think it should be the phrase that has been used. What I mean is look at the organizations that have been formed now, give them credit for what they have done, and then improve it. If you think they don't communicate well enough, try to find a way to get them to communicate. In other words, it's a building, every generation builds on what has been done before. That's how I look at it. You are right what I said about, but you see, I was saying it from the point of view of someone here, because I do think respect and empathy for the people back home is important. And so I'm trying to say it is easier for me to speak out here. I can't say someone else back home should speak because the dangers that they face are greater than the dangers I face. But I do understand that some people have to sacrifice in order for their societies and their communities to move forward. Okay, somebody has to die, somebody has to be jailed. At the same time, we can't be cavalier about that. Now, I do know 1 or 2 organizations. One is headed by Ethiopians who actually send books back home. But Estelle is right. It's a matter of communication. A lot of things are happening that we don't know about. And I'm saying let's commend those people, and then let's find a way to help them to fix whatever deficiencies we see. I thank you very much. In fact, talk about lack of communication. I've learned a lot. I mean, there are people I didn't know were doing such good work. So actually it makes me feel better because I think, people younger than me are doing even much more, so I'm not as lonely as I thought. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I was actually going to piggyback on what you just said about thanking those who are already trying to organize this. It's inevitably going to be that there are too many organizations. But without, Compare Afrique, organizing these kind of events, we will not find out that these things exist. So this is a great step, and that's why I was very excited to learn about, this event happening. I mean, it's a given. The U.S. is a huge country. There's going to be associations in Maine that don't know anything about what's happening in Texas. But I think events like this are going to be great, and I think is that the Young African Professional Network, that brings, Africans together and they get to discuss and you get to network, interact with different people. I think those are helping, towards getting the knowledge out. A blog is another great avenue to get these things out, to get people, people to know what's happening. I just want to comment again on that, the fear of dying, being involved in policy or, making change happen. I think that should drive us who are here and feel safe to support those who are on the ground, facing that fear and being brave. Not everybody's going to be brave and want to face, whatever consequences. But I think that should drive us to be even more engaged. I have a brother who has, survived some assassination attempts because of his involvement. And whenever I hear that, whenever I get a phone call like at 2 a.m, my sister telling me that they're somehow in the corner of the house looking out, see what's happening, it makes me want to be even more engaged because I feel guilty for not being there at that moment, to help out, even though it's, it sounds somewhat very selfish, but I think on a bigger scale, knowing that there are those activists on the ground who are trying to make change happen, risking their lives, should drive all of us to support them.
And the way it should is tell the U.S. not to support dictators, because if you had democracy, then your brother wouldn't be worried. This is how you can help protect him from here.
Can I just add one more thing, which is I think we should be we should be afraid of any single entity. So there's a danger in a single story, and there's a danger in a single organization that represents all of us. So for me, the problem is not that there are a lot of organizations. It's about who are they, what are they doing, are they replicating efforts, or are they doing distinctive initiatives? Are they communicating with each other, and do they have impact? Because I do think competition will drive excellence, but right now we don't have systems to really monitor and regulate what people do and how well they do it, and to hold them accountable.
Yeah, I definitely agree. The one thing I've found is that there's no one place where it lists all the African blogs or all the African organizations in the U.S. And I think that's one thing I know I've had a conversation with Jamoke about, for example, aggregating all the African blogs, because you have people who have a voice and they're talking about different things, but not all of us necessarily know about their voices, which we need to, because what they're talking about is important. So that what Estelle was asking, that's a very important question we need to ask.
There's that gentleman and then the gentleman in the back.
Good afternoon. I have one note that I'd like to bring up, which is also in South America and in the Caribbean. They're also a huge part of the global African diaspora, so whenever possible to be conscious about our brothers and sisters that speak Portuguese and Spanish and learning about their stories. So I have a friend who's Syrian American, and he lobbies for the Free Syrian Army. He has a lot of resources because the Qataris pay him like all this money to fly him around the world and everything. And obviously he's been doing it for almost 3 years now, and with limited effectiveness. But he doesn't have something that we have as a community, which is the expected solidarity with the African American community here. So I have just a couple of questions. One, how effective do you think that a congressional report card would be, like a scoring card similar to what other advocacy organizations do? And also, how effective, or do you think the CBC could be doing more in terms of working towards our foreign policy towards Africa?
Okay, and then the gentleman in the back.
I had a question about dual citizenship. I'm just curious as to how one could pledge allegiance to the United States of America and to the Republic, and at the same time have some allegiance to your country, because it seems like it's knowing American policy. They're looking out for themselves. Would you not find yourself in somewhat of a conflict or contradiction with it? Because it won't always be in your favor of the people. You know what I mean? So pledging allegiance to the United States, you have to be careful. I mean, that's what one has to do to become a citizen right here. So for people with dual citizenship, how does one deal with that? Just curious.
So there's 3 questions. One on a congressional report card, and from the gentleman over there, and then can the CBC, the Congressional Black Caucus, be doing more in terms of advocacy? And then the gentleman in the back asked a question about dual citizenship and how one can keep 2 allegiances.
I think I'll take the question on the congressional report card. I think it's something that Nee said when he was here earlier talking about politics, and even when Obama was elected, we're thinking he's going to have a better policy towards Africa. But here's the U.S. president. I think there is a constituency that they have to report to. Like the congressional report card is relevant in the sense that it's going to affect somebody in the U.S. to vote a certain way. If they think that, if that card isn't going to matter, it's not really going to change much. But I think for states where you have a certain population, if there's like a state where there are a lot of Ethiopians, for example, who are American Ethiopians, and who can be influenced by in a certain district, and it has to be very targeted, I believe.
Yeah.
If those that concentration of Ethiopians can influence an election outcome in a given district, the congressman is going to definitely look at getting that card and receive an A on supporting Ethiopia or supporting Africa, if that's going to influence. I think that we have it's a matter of finding out what's the concentration of a given population and how can they influence election outcomes. On the question of dual citizenship, likely I don't have that problem, so that's not challenging me that much. But I have friends who say they're citizens of the world. They probably see the documents, the passport as a travel document that helps me get in different places easier, but they can still care about what's going on in the African continent, trying to make change in their own countries. Some countries have a history where, like, if I give an example of Burundi, the history of violence, a lot of people fled the country, there's generations that grew up outside the country, and now they're coming back at the end of the war, and some of these are the ones who are running the country now. You know, there's a lot of ministers and vice presidents who have dual citizenship because of this historical context that's particular to Burundi.
I mean, I think I can answer the gentleman's question at the back. I think that's a question that's very sensitive, and I think without stepping on any like minefields or anything like that, I think I have Kenyan citizenship. I'm fully Kenyan citizenship. I don't have dual citizenship, but I have family members that are U.S. citizenship, family members that have dual citizenships. And I think for me, how I understand it is the fact that advocacy isn't about people, it's about rights. So I can talk about an issue, and it applies to both the U.S. and to my country, Kenya. For example, my niece is right over there, and I wouldn't advocate for something that would be against the United States because she's a United States citizen. So it depends on what you define advocacy for and what you're advocating for. Is it for the people and for their own self-interest, or are you advocating for fundamental rights that every single human being should have?
One last question.
I want to ask a question on funding again, specifically how dangerous funding can be from foreign NGOs. I'm thinking specifically of like how USAID has one of the largest development budgets right now in the continent, and now they're very publicly partnering with AFRICOM, the U.S. Military Central Command in Africa. So now we see this hyper-militarization of humanitarian aid. So I guess that's kind of the context I'm coming from in asking the question of what kind of challenges, for those of you folks who are starting your own groups, what kind of challenges do you find in getting that funding that you want to then disseminate out? Because I do think it's really important to have this more mindful funding. So I was wondering if you could share more about that.
Sure, plenty of challenges. I think, well, first there is the issue of ethics and values around funding. And each organization has to define its own values and ethics in terms of who they'll accept funding from and who they cannot accept funding from. And that's the first decision that we, as a very new organization, we also just started in October. That's something we are developing right now and working on. Because funding does come with conditions and conditionalities, and which ones can we live with and which ones can we not live with. But I think for us, as an organization that's in a way trying to do both, raise money and give money, what we're doing is our focus is on getting diaspora Africans to invest in African organizations and to invest in us as well. So we're going directly to the people to circumnavigate some of the challenges that you would have getting funding from a U.S. aid or another governmental institution or even private institutions. But the challenge, as always, has been how does an organization start its work, right? Because I always say to funders, give us 3 years of seed grant, then we'll show you that we can be self-sustainable. But where do we get that initial support from, and what kind of compromises do we have to make? And we're having that difficult conversation right now, and I don't really have specific answers, but that I think funding on the continent really does worry me. Before starting Africans in the Diaspora, I was managing African investments at a foundation, so I've sat at the other end of it, a public, private foundation. But it does worry me, not just from government institutions, but also from private NGOs in terms of how agendas and priorities are defined externally, but implemented locally, and that's dangerous for our own development and our own agency, and we need to take ownership of that process as Africans. And at Africans in the Diaspora, we're trying to make a case for the diaspora to say, can we do it together? I can't do it individually, but can we build this collectively so that we can address these challenges?
DevK Africa, we definitely took a while in deciding whether we should be a nonprofit or a corporation. And I think for us, we didn't want anyone to say that they have ownership over the organization. So for example, if I die today, DevK will still continue. So for us, we launched our funding process actually yesterday. And because we're trying to be an organization that is, I guess, by the people, not to, not to steal a phrase, but we are actually doing it through Indiegogo. So we're asking Africans in the Diaspora to actually donate to DevK Africa. And I think that's important because then no one person can claim either an interest in the organization or ownership in that organization, which is very important, I think, for civil organizations in Africa.
And the only one thing I would add to that, because we launched, our platform is like Indiegogo, but focused on Africans in the diaspora for African initiatives. And the one thing that did surprise me, we launched the organization in October, and 6 weeks later, we launched a 6-week campaign to fundraise for 3 African organizations. And I expected the diaspora to mobilize and support us, and all we wanted to do was raise $30,000 because we are so new. We weren't sure if people would have faith and trust in us. We ended up raising close to $40,000 in 6 weeks. So I do have faith that the diaspora is ready, that people are ready to invest in Africa and in African institutions, and what we've been missing is the platform and the opportunity to do so.
So those are the last questions. Do you guys have any closing statements on the topic issue? You guys, all 3 of you.
Ladies first, huh?
Oh, someone of benefits.
I'm a gentleman.
I mean, the one thing, I guess when you send out the emails, the last, I guess, thing you talked about is whether the diaspora community is, I guess, the architects of development back on the continent. And I mean, I kept looking at that question. I was like, architects, okay. How are we supposed to be, the people that, build up Africa? And I think, as Nee was talking about, I think it's important to realize that we are Africans of the diaspora, but we don't know better than those on the continent. So are we architects of development? I don't think so. I think we're part of that collaborative effort to see development on that continent. So.
I mean, I couldn't agree more with what you said, so I don't want to take up any more time, but just to say we do have a really critical and important role to play as collaborative efforts or as partners. But let's temper what we know and what we have with what we don't know and what we don't have. And let's always seek to learn and to humble ourselves.
I just went to this the issue of African responsibility towards to the diaspora towards Africa. And when I first saw that, I was wondering, when you say Africa, sometimes it sounds like almost abstract. It's almost like a concept. But when you break that down to who is Africa, it's our brothers and sisters, our aunts, our parents, teachers, preachers, and so all this, that's the whole make Africa. When you break that down, you will definitely find that you have a responsibility towards those people, either on an individual basis, as a community, as a country, or as a continent. So I think one of the issues we didn't mention today is the issue of remittances. I joked earlier that most of African diaspora are working nonprofit organizations because they're funding somebody, on the continent. We're NGOs. Last year, there was $60 billion were sent from the diaspora to Africa. Ugandans alone sent about $879 million. On average, Uganda and the U.S. sent about between $500 and $1,000 a month. So I think that's these are contributions that people are making. The remittances are 50% more than foreign aid. In some countries, it's the remittances are bigger than foreign aid and obviously direct investments. So there's a contribution that we're making. I think the next stage, if our governments can figure out a way to harness these funds, this capital that's coming in our countries, I think that can go a long way towards leveraging private investments. Those in the country, the DevKs, and I think that can go a long way if there's a way to harness those. I'm starting to read the new book by Chimamanda, it's Americana, where she talks about this. I think if you met with the main character, just being she went to was at Princeton and living a good life, having a fellowship, good speaking fees, but somehow seeing pictures of her friends on Facebook and on blogs who are opening businesses, starting investment banks, and just longing to be there. So I'm thinking as our countries rise, there will be more of that sentiment of those who want to go there and apply as the time comes the knowledge, the skills, the capital that we've gained from this side of the world.
Can I just add one more thing? Just one last thing, because you sparked that interest. I think it's important for us to think about, because everyone is talking about the diaspora and what we can contribute back home right now, to think about, are we an opportunity for exploitation, or are we a source and resource of change and dialogue? And we need to be very careful about how the diaspora is integrated into these development conversations. And to be careful about it, it's important for us to organize ourselves, to build our own movements and institutions so that we appear at these tables as drivers. I'm really grateful, for example, for the Global Diaspora Forum, But I would like for Africans and diasporans to drive that conversation, not to attend as participants and attendees. And I think that's the next step for us. How do we professionalize and institutionalize in a positive way what we do and what we can offer?
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
So on behalf of compareafrique.com and IPS, I would like to thank everyone for attending this event. Please keep this conversation going. You can visit www.compareafrique, compare in English, Afrique in French, to engage on conversation on these types of issues, as well as if you're interested in submitting an article. Also, please remember to sign the sign-in sheet to be informed about future IPS events like this. So thank you again for IPS for hosting this discussion.
Thank you. And on the seats you had a flyer about an event on the Congo.